You're listening to Teracota Chronicles, where broken pieces find their way back to wholeness. Recently, I started to feel this pull, almost like an assignment to share what I've come to know as true. Because the only truth I can speak to is my own. Take what resonates, leave what doesn't. I'm not going to debate. I'm just answering the call to tell my story. And if you stay with me, you'll hear how I was broken, how I survived it all, and how I rebuilt my life beyond everything I was told I couldn't have. My name? Well, I'm going to save that part for later. Over the past 6 years, I've gone through what I can only describe as a profound transformation in mind and in spirit. Some call it an awakening, others are calling it a shift or even an activation. I'm simply calling it change because at the end of the day, I am just not the same person I once was. And if you've ever found yourself still smiling so others feel comfortable, still showing up, doing what's expected, while something inside of you feels empty, then I want you to know something. You are not alone. This isn't a sermon, it's a story, a living journal of how I got here. And maybe somewhere in it, you'll find your way back to yourself too. So let me take you to my beginning. I was 12 years old when I felt something move through me that the church called the Holy Ghost or Holy Spirit. It was a wave, an energy moving through me that pushed me to stand when the preacher made the call to Christ. I stood. I remember it clearly. I felt so moved by his words, the cadence in his preacher style voice, the whooping, the call and response. It was like a drum calling me forward. It was connecting to something deep inside. And even though I was a young girl, in that moment, I felt like I was understanding something bigger than myself. I wasn't performing. It wasn't about impressing the grown-ups around me. It just happened. I stood up. It was the 80s, a very different time. Religion wasn't necessarily the heart of every household, but I do remember that in many homes there was a picture of Jesus somewhere on the wall or a cross hanging in the house. But in my world, it wasn't like that. Church was more of an occasional event, Easter, Christmas. Those were usually the times that my family went into the church building. But this particular time was different. It was summer. A revival was happening. It was a week-long parade of these traveling speakers that had come through the town to, I guess, light a fire under the congregation. And I was there with my grandma. Now, I spent almost every weekend I could with my grandma. I love her. She was my heart. But she wasn't the typical church grandma that you might think. The one who everybody calls mother, and you know what I mean? She's the praying grandma, that was not my grandmother. My grandmother was very honest about who she was and where she stood and how she thought. She was the pistol carrying kind of grandma. And we used to make a big deal out of that. Grandma got a gun. She was the Medea type grandma. I mean, if I can paint the picture for you, this woman was strong. She was a tough woman, but she was also a tender woman. As a matter of fact, like there's this story that um I used to hear about when I was little, because when I was a younger, I'd sit and just absorb what the family would be talking about. And I'd sit quietly because the longer you're quiet, the longer you get to stay in the room and hear all the tea. So this story went a little bit like this, and I'm gonna just give you a taste. I'll have to come back to it. But grandma, there was this young man who had come to her house to have dinner, and she recognized him. And I can't give it all to you now. This is in its own episode. I tell you. Long story short, she beat him down. She beat him down and put the boy in the hospital, and it was behind her daughter. So if you want to imagine, you can imagine, but we will come back to that one at some point. Anyway, that was grandma. She just was who she was, and it was who she had to be, right? The single mother raising these children. It was who she had to be. um, but there was also, like I said, just tender part to my grandmother. She was very helpful, very kind, loved to help young single mothers, and she didn't pretend to be a big churchgoer, you know. She had her own understanding of church. And honestly, I didn't fully grasp how much she understood until I was about 18 years old. But on this particular night, I think she was at the church because she had heard about the speaker and she was just trying it out, just trying church. And we were there for the ride, me and my cousins, as well as my brother. So, yeah, I stood up. And my little brother, he stood up behind me. Now, I knew why I stood up, but I'm not so sure he knew what he was doing. But he did follow me. Within a month, we were back at the church for baptism. And, we had on our little white outfits and we were giggling and excited and, just so worried about getting dunked in the water, wondering if we would choke or panic or be scared. But I remember that moment because when I went under the water, I felt electrified. I mean, completely in awe of what was moving inside of me. Back then, I called it God's Spirit. Today, I might describe it differently, but the experience itself was real. But life has a way of changing environments, right? And soon after that baptism, my world shifted. What I didn't realize at the time was the feeling I experienced at 12, it wasn't gone. It had simply gone quiet because I found myself in an environment where survival mattered more than spirituality. It was 1986. I had just graduated from primary school and was sent straight into high school. Yeah. The district had shut down all the middle schools. So all of us that were still children were dropped into a world we weren't ready for. One minute we had recess on playgrounds. We were making Muppets and playing with Muppets, and we had clay and art class scheduled and all sorts of childlike things. And the next, there were class bells, late bells, stairwells, long hallways, and teachers who had no patience for us. Even the older students resented us being there. And honestly, I understand why. We didn't belong in that space, and everything in me felt it. That year, I fell apart. I failed the seventh grade. Every report card, straight F's. I couldn't even take home my report card. They mailed it every report period. I went from being a cooperative, responsible kid to becoming the class clown and just trying to survive the room. Because the truth is, I had to fight. Even when I didn't want to, I had to fight. I didn't have the right clothes, I didn't fit the look, and I was constantly reminded of it. I was awkward because I'm taller than everybody else. I felt out of place and trying to figure out who I needed to be, just to be accepted. Somewhere in that process, the girl that I was, she didn't survive it. I became who I thought I needed to be instead. Church fell away. And in its place came fighting, skipping school, underage drinking, and trying to belong however I could. And then I had to repeat the seventh grade, and it broke something in me. Listen, I cried. I watched everyone that I started that middle school process with move on while I stayed behind. And that was my first real loss. But it was also the moment that I realized something. You know, those same people that I was clowning with, I was trying so hard to impress and be a part of, they were still doing their work and they passed. Or maybe some of them, their parents paid for the summer school, but mine wouldn't. And I had to stay back. I made a decision after that happened. I said, you know, I'm not doing this ever again. I changed. I decided to start living up to my potential and not worrying about being teased for being smart. And I started making straight A's. I was already in the choir. I've always been drawn to music. So I was a part of the choir and starting to make a name for myself there. And then I got into the musical theater. And I just found myself in music. It was where I came alive. And I found favor with my choir teachers, and that world belonged to me. But even then, the label that I had already created, the reputation of that foundation of my first year in middle school slash high school, I was placed as the trouble kid and it followed me. And no matter how many A's I got and how hard I tried to overturn the destruction I'd done, I couldn't fix that reputation and I couldn't bring my GPA up to where I could get noticed for good things. In fact, I remember sitting in the counselor's office being told that no matter what I did, it wouldn't be enough for college. And I believed him. Not because it was true, but because I had already learned what it felt like to fall behind. But something else happened to me too. Let me say this. Um, you know, though he was saying, "Oh, you won't ever look," he literally showed me another person's grades that had those middle of the road grades, the B's, the C's, a couple of D's, but not anywhere near what I had done with the straight F's, like straight F's. So he shows me that and he says, this person can't even make it into college. And I just felt like, oh, wow, you know. So college was off of my radar. It just wasn't something that I was supposed to have. But okay, something else did happen. So that moment, that moment really was the first turn of the wheel in my life. It's 1989 slash 90 school year. I'm in the 11th grade, a little older than most, still carrying the weight of everything I had just come through. And I'm in a new school. It's a whole new world. And that's where I met two young women who stood out to me in a way I didn't expect. I'd met girls like them before, but something about these two felt different. They greeted me with, really warm smiles and an openness that immediately caught my attention. They weren't the most popular girls in the high school, but they carried something, a quiet confidence and a lightness about them. And it struck me the most that they were so open about their love for Jesus. And I thought, wow. And it wasn't awkward, right? It wasn't the awkward and I'm not trying to put any labels or, make you all, but it wasn't an awkward thing. It wasn't even pushy or preachy. They were just simply happy girls. They were friendly, they were inviting, and for me, having been where I came from, that was new because where I had just come from, life was different. It felt like survival. Like you always had to prove something. Strength mattered, toughness mattered, reputation mattered. And even when I didn't want to fight, fighting seemed to find me. I remember feeling tired even at that age. So by the time I encountered them with their peace, their joy, their ease, it felt like I was seeing another way to live, a way that didn't require hardness, a way that didn't require proving yourself through conflict. And something in me became curious. I wanted to understand what made them the way that they were. And that curiosity led me to make one of the most important decisions of my life. I decided I wanted to live the Christian life too. What I didn't realize then was that this moment would set me on a path that would take me much farther than I ever imagined. And not just into understanding, but into another kind of experience. Because what I found there wasn't only peace, there was beauty, yes, but there was also confusion, pressure, and a different kind of pain I wasn't prepared for. I didn't go from broken to whole. I went from one kind of survival into another kind. Life didn't stop there. In fact, it got more complicated. Some of that I'm going to come back to, and we're going to talk about it throughout this channel. But here's where I want to leave you. Years later, I found myself the girl from the background who wasn't supposed to amount to anything. I found myself standing inside the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. And in that moment, I finally received the answer to a question I'd been asking for years. Why am I here? What am I supposed to do with all of this? And the answer came. Simple, clear, direct. Tell them the truth. You've been listening to Teracota Chronicles, and if something in my story resonated with you, if it mirrored your life, your questions, or your own awakening, I hope it reminds you you are not alone. I'm not here to perform or present a polished version of myself. What I'm offering is honesty. And if you choose to stay with me, this story is still unfolding. I'll return with the next part. Be open, be well, and be at peace until we meet again.